What happens when a veteran journalist thinks he's cornered his prey, only to discover he's walked straight into a trap? Marcus Steele thought ambushing Attorney General nominee Patricia Walsh at Reagan National Airport would be the perfect gotcha moment. Armed with nothing but his camera crew and years of hostile interview experience, he expected another viral takedown for his highlight reel. But Walsh hadn't spent 15 years as a federal prosecutor without learning how to handle predators. The black leather briefcase she carried wasn't just for show. It contained something that would turn Steele's ambush into his own public execution. What unfolded in Terminal B wasn't just an interview gone wrong. It was a masterclass in preparation versus arrogance, and the security footage would become the most shared airport video in internet history. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The automatic doors of Reagan National Airport slid open with a mechanical whisper, releasing a rush of climate-controlled air into the humid Washington evening. Inside Terminal B, the usual symphony of rolling luggage, gate announcements, and overlapping conversations created the perfect backdrop for what Marcus Steele believed would be his greatest professional triumph. He had been tracking Patricia Walsh's movements for 3 days, studying her travel patterns through a network of sources that stretched from Capitol Hill to the Department of Justice. Tonight, she was flying back to her home state of Colorado for what her office had described as personal meetings with family. Steele knew better. His intelligence suggested she was actually meeting with key senators who remained undecided on her confirmation as Attorney General. It was the kind of behind-the-scenes maneuvering that voters deserved to know about, and Steele intended to expose it. Standing near the security checkpoint, Steele adjusted his navy blazer and ran his fingers through his silver hair. At 52, he had perfected the art of the ambush interview. His technique was legendary among political journalists' approach. The target with seeming casualness, ask an innocuous opening question to lower their guard, then strike with the real accusation. The key was creating a moment of vulnerability, catching them off balance when they couldn't retreat to prepared talking points or hide behind handlers. He had used this method to topple cabinet nominees, expose congressional scandals, and build a reputation as the most feared interviewer in Washington. Tonight would be no different. His camera operator, a seasoned professional named Derek who had worked with him for over a decade, positioned himself strategically near a pillar with a clear line of sight to the gate area. The sound technician, Maria, checked her equipment one final time while pretending to scroll through her phone. They had done this dance dozens of times before, and each knew their role without discussion. Steele would create the moment, Derek would capture it, and Maria would ensure every word was recorded with crystal clarity. By tomorrow morning, the footage would be trending across every social media platform, cable news network, and political blog in America. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Walsh's flight to Denver was scheduled to depart at 8:15, which meant she would arrive at the gate around 7:30. Steele had positioned his team to intercept her during the 10-minute window between security and boarding, when she would be most relaxed and least prepared for confrontation. His research indicated she typically traveled with minimal security detail on personal trips, making her an ideal target for the kind of impromptu journalism that had made his career. He had even prepared his opening gambit, a seemingly friendly question about her family visit that would seamlessly transition into accusations about secret political meetings. But as Steele waited in the terminal's sterile environment, surrounded by the constant flow of travelers and the distant hum of jet engines, he failed to notice something crucial. Patricia Walsh was not the kind of person who traveled anywhere unprepared. Her reputation as a federal prosecutor hadn't been built on luck or political connections. It had been forged in courtrooms where preparation meant the difference between justice and acquittal, where a single overlooked detail could destroy months of investigative work. She understood better than most that in high-stakes environments, the person who controlled the information controlled the outcome. Walsh had known about Steele's surveillance almost from the moment it began. Her security detail, though deliberately minimal for optics, included a counterintelligence specialist who had spent 15 years protecting federal officials from exactly this kind of harassment. The specialist had identified Steele's pattern within 48 hours and had been feeding Walsh detailed reports about his movements, his team's positioning, and even the questions he had been asking his sources. She knew he would be waiting at the airport. She knew he would try to corner her near the gate, and she had planned accordingly. The black leather briefcase she carried wasn't a prop or an affectation. It contained documentation that Steele's own investigation had inadvertently provided evidence of activities that went far beyond aggressive journalism and crossed into territories that federal law enforcement took very seriously. While Steele had been focused on tracking her movements, Walsh had been tracking his, and what she had discovered would have shocked even his harshest critics. The ambush he was planning would indeed become viral content, but not in the way he anticipated. At 7:28, Walsh emerged from the security checkpoint. She moved with the measured pace of someone accustomed to being watched, her expression calm and professional. She wore a charcoal gray suit that projected authority without ostentation, and her shoulder-length auburn hair was pulled back in a style that suggested competence rather than vanity. To the casual observer, she appeared to be just another business traveler making her way to a late evening flight. But Steele, watching from his position near the gate area, saw something else entirely, an opportunity that had finally presented itself. He approached her with the practiced casualness that had served him well throughout his career. His expression was friendly, almost apologetic, as if he were merely a fellow traveler who had happened to recognize her. Derek began recording from his concealed position, the camera's lens capturing every nuance of the encounter. Maria activated her directional microphone, ensuring that even the slightest whisper would be preserved for posterity. The trap, as far as Steele was concerned, had been perfectly set. "Attorney General nominee Walsh," he called out, his voice carrying just the right mixture of surprise and professional courtesy. "What a coincidence running into you here. I hope you don't mind, but I'd love to ask you a quick question about your upcoming confirmation hearings." Walsh paused in her stride and turned to face him. Her expression remained neutral, neither welcoming nor hostile. She had encountered hundreds of journalists during her career, and she could read their intentions with the same precision she had once used to evaluate hostile witnesses. Steele's approach was textbook ambush journalism, the false friendliness, the manufactured coincidence, the casual reference to controversial topics. She had been expecting this moment for days, and she was ready. "Of course," she replied, her voice steady and controlled. "Though I should mention that I'm on my way to a family gathering in Colorado. Perhaps we could arrange a more formal interview through my office when I return." It was exactly the kind of deflection Steele had anticipated, and it provided him with the perfect opening for his real line of attack. He had learned through his network of sources that Walsh's family gathering was actually a cover story for a series of private meetings with undecided senators. These meetings, if they were indeed taking place, would represent a potentially unethical attempt to influence her confirmation vote through personal lobbying rather than the formal process. It was the kind of story that could derail a nomination and cement his reputation as the journalist who exposed corruption at the highest levels of government. "Actually," he said, stepping slightly closer to ensure his words would be captured clearly by the recording equipment, "I'm curious about these family meetings you're attending. My sources suggest they might involve more than just personal conversations. Are you planning to meet with Senator Reynolds and Senator Martinez while you're in Colorado? Because if so, that would raise some serious questions about the propriety of private lobbying during an active confirmation process." The accusation hung in the air between them like a gauntlet thrown down on the polished airport floor. Steele had delivered it with the practiced timing of a performer who understood exactly how to create maximum dramatic impact. He knew that Walsh would now be forced into one of two responses, either a defensive denial that would make her appear guilty, or an angry outburst that would provide even better footage for his story. Either way, he would have the viral moment he needed to dominate the next news cycle. But Walsh's reaction was neither defensive nor angry. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, as if considering his question with genuine intellectual curiosity. Her expression remained completely composed, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same measured tone she might have used to address a jury during closing arguments. "That's an interesting theory," she said, setting her briefcase down on a nearby bench. "I appreciate you bringing it to my attention. It gives me an opportunity to address some misconceptions that seem to be circulating about my travel plans." Steele felt a momentary flicker of uncertainty. This wasn't the response he had expected. Most politicians, when confronted with unexpected accusations, either became defensive or tried to end the conversation as quickly as possible. Walsh seemed to be inviting further discussion, which could only mean she was more confident in her position than his sources had suggested. But he had come too far to back down now, and his camera was still rolling. "So you're denying that you have meetings scheduled with undecided senators?" he pressed, his voice taking on the more aggressive tone that his audience had come to expect. "Because I have multiple sources confirming that these meetings are on your calendar. Are you saying my sources are lying?" Walsh reached for her briefcase and opened it with deliberate care. Inside, Steele could see neat stacks of documents, each marked with colored tabs and organized with the precision of someone accustomed to handling complex legal cases. She withdrew a single sheet of paper and held it at an angle where Derek's camera could capture it clearly. "I'm not saying your sources are lying," she replied, her voice remaining perfectly level. "I'm saying they're incomplete. This is my actual itinerary for the Colorado trip, filed with the appropriate ethics offices and fully documented according to federal guidelines. As you can see, I am indeed meeting with my sister and her family in Boulder, attending my nephew's high school graduation ceremony, and having dinner with my elderly parents in Colorado Springs. No senators, no political meetings, no attempts to influence the confirmation process outside of proper channels." She held the document steady, allowing the camera to record every detail. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." The itinerary was official, time-stamped, and included contact information for verification. It showed exactly what she had claimed, a series of personal family events with no political component whatsoever. Steele stared at the paper, his mind racing as he tried to process this unexpected development. His sources had been so certain, so specific in their details. How could they have been so completely wrong? But Walsh wasn't finished. She replaced the first document and withdrew another, this one bearing the letterhead of the Department of Justice Office of Inspector General. Her movements remained calm and methodical, as if she were presenting evidence to a grand jury rather than responding to an ambush interview in an airport terminal. "What's more interesting," she continued, "is how you obtained what you believe to be my private travel information. Because according to this preliminary investigation report, someone has been illegally accessing federal travel databases to track the movements of government officials. The investigation was opened after unusual activity was detected in systems containing sensitive security information." Steele's confident expression began to waver. The document Walsh was displaying contained details that made his stomach clench with recognition. It referenced specific database queries that matched the information he had been receiving from his source inside the Travel Security Administration. But that source had assured him that the access was legitimate, part of routine security monitoring. that fell within the bounds of journalistic investigation. The possibility that he had been receiving illegally obtained information had never been seriously considered. The third document Walsh produced sent a chill down Steele's spine. It was a federal court order authorizing surveillance of electronic communications related to the database breach investigation. The order was dated 3 days earlier, which meant that law enforcement had been monitoring the situation for exactly the period during which Steele had been receiving his most detailed intelligence about Walsh's travel plans. If his communications with his source had been intercepted, if his own involvement in the database breach had been documented, then he was facing far more serious consequences than a failed ambush interview. As a federal prosecutor, Walsh said, her voice taking on the authoritative tone she had perfected during years of courtroom practice, I'm required to report any evidence of criminal activity that comes to my attention. The illegal access to federal databases is a serious felony, punishable by up to 10 years in federal prison. The unauthorized disclosure of government travel information related to national security officials carries additional penalties under the Espionage Act. I've already forwarded all relevant evidence to the appropriate authorities for investigation. The airport terminal suddenly felt smaller, more confining. Steele was aware of the constant flow of passengers around them, any one of whom might be recording this encounter on their phone. Derek continued filming from his position near the Fayozun pillar, but Steele could see uncertainty in his camera operator's expression. Maria had lowered her directional microphone, clearly sensing that the story was taking a turn that none of them had anticipated. The ambush that was supposed to destroy Walsh's nomination was rapidly becoming something else entirely. Walsh reached into her briefcase one final time and withdrew a thick manila envelope sealed with evidence tape. She held it carefully, as if its contents were both valuable and dangerous. This envelope contains copies of all communications between your source inside the Transportation Security Administration and various media outlets over the past 6 months, she said. It includes metadata analysis, financial records showing payments for information, and correspondence that clearly establishes a pattern of illegal data trafficking. Your name appears in these communications 47 times. Your producer's name appears 32 times. Your network's corporate account shows payments totaling $68,000 for what your source described as premium access to government travel tracking systems. The words hit Steele like physical blows. He had assumed that his arrangement with the TSA source was a standard journalist-source relationship, protected by press freedom precedents and professional ethics guidelines. The payments his network had made were, in his understanding, routine compensation for information that fell within the public interest exception. The possibility that he had been participating in a criminal conspiracy had simply never occurred to him, despite warnings from colleagues who questioned the specificity and sensitivity of the intelligence he had been receiving. Around them, the normal sounds of airport activity continued, but Steele felt increasingly isolated from the ordinary world of travelers and flight announcements. Security officers were beginning to take notice of the gathering, though they maintained their distance while clearly monitoring the situation. A supervisor had appeared near the gate desk, speaking quietly into his radio while keeping his eyes fixed on the group. The encounter that had begun as routine investigative journalism was attracting the kind of official attention that no journalist wanted to face. Walsh closed her briefcase with the same methodical precision she had shown throughout the encounter. Her expression remained composed, professional, and completely free of triumph or vindictiveness. She had presented her evidence with the dispassionate efficiency of a prosecutor making a case to a jury, allowing the facts to speak for themselves, without editorial commentary or emotional manipulation. "I want to be very clear about something," she said, her voice carrying across the terminal space with quiet authority. "I don't take any pleasure in this situation. Journalism is essential to our democracy, and I have enormous respect for reporters who pursue the truth through legitimate means. But what you've been involved in isn't journalism. It's criminal conspiracy dressed up as news gathering. The evidence will speak for itself in court." She picked up her briefcase and began walking toward her gate, her pace unhurried and her demeanor unchanged. But before she had taken more than a few steps, she paused and turned back to face Steele one final time. "Oh, and Marcus," she said, using his first name with casual familiarity that somehow made her words more unsettling. "You might want to check the news feeds in about 10 minutes. The Department of Justice is issuing arrest warrants for everyone involved in the database breach conspiracy. I believe your source is already in federal custody. Have a good evening." With that, she continued toward her gate, leaving Steele standing in the middle of the terminal with his mouth slightly open and his usual confidence completely shattered. Derek lowered his camera, understanding instinctively that continuing to record would only create evidence of their own involvement in whatever legal catastrophe was about to unfold. Maria began packing her equipment with nervous efficiency, her eyes darting toward the security officers who were now approaching their position with purposeful strides. The lead security officer, a veteran TS, a supervisor with 20 years of experience in airport law enforcement, approached Steele with professional courtesy but unmistakable authority. His uniform was crisp, his badge polished, and his expression suggested someone who had dealt with every conceivable type of airport incident during his long career. "Sir," the officer said, his voice calm but firm, "I'm going to need you and your crew to come with me. We've received instructions from federal law enforcement to detain you for questioning in connection with an ongoing criminal investigation. You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly advise you to exercise that right until you can speak with an attorney." The words seemed to echo through the terminal space, drawing curious stares from nearby passengers. Steele tried to respond, to assert his rights as a journalist, to demand an explanation of the charges against him. But his voice seemed to have deserted him, just as his confidence and his certainty about the righteousness of his cause had evaporated under Walsh's methodical presentation of evidence. The ambush predator had become the prey, and the transformation had happened so quickly and completely that he still couldn't fully process what had occurred. As security officers escorted him and his crew toward a restricted area near the terminals, administrative offices, Steele caught a glimpse of Walsh boarding her flight to Colorado. She moved with the same measured grace she had displayed throughout their encounter, her briefcase at her side and her expression suggesting nothing more dramatic than routine travel. She didn't look back, didn't acknowledge the commotion she had left in her wake, didn't display any sign of satisfaction at his downfall. She simply boarded her plane and took her seat, ready to attend her nephew's graduation ceremony, exactly as her official itinerary had indicated. The security office where Steele and his crew were taken was a sterile, windowless room designed for processing problem passengers and conducting administrative interviews. The fluorescent lighting was harsh, the furniture was minimal, and the atmosphere was deliberately intimidating. Federal agents arrived within 30 minutes, their badges identifying them as representatives of the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. They carried briefcases of their own, filled with evidence that would soon transform Steele's failed ambush into the foundation of a federal case that would dominate headlines for months to come. The irony was inescapable. Steele had built his career on exposing the secrets of powerful people, on dragging them into the light of public scrutiny and forcing them to account for their actions. Now he found himself on the other side of the equation, facing questions from federal investigators who had been building their case with the same methodical precision that Walsh had displayed in the terminal. The hunter had indeed become the hunted, and the evidence against him was as overwhelming as anything he had ever assembled against his own targets. In the hours that followed, as Steele sat in a federal holding facility awaiting arraignment on charges that could end his career, and send him to prison. The video of his encounter with Walsh began circulating online. The footage, recorded by Derek's camera and seized as evidence, was eventually released through proper legal channels and quickly became viral content. But unlike the viral moments Steele had created throughout his career, this video didn't showcase his journalistic prowess or his ability to expose corruption in high places. Instead, it showed a master prosecutor calmly dismantling a predator who had mistaken criminal conspiracy for investigative journalism. It showed the power of preparation, the importance of facts over accusations, and the inevitable consequences of crossing lines that should never be crossed. Most importantly, it showed Patricia Walsh walking away from the wreckage of Steele's ambush with her dignity intact and her nomination stronger than ever, heading home to Colorado to attend her nephew's graduation exactly as she had always planned to do. The story that was supposed to destroy her career had instead ended his, and the security footage of him being led away in handcuffs became a permanent reminder that in the game of political ambush, the person with the best evidence always wins. Walsh had understood this fundamental truth from the beginning, which was why she had walked into Steele's trap so willingly. She knew she wasn't walking into an ambush at all. She was walking into an opportunity to demonstrate exactly why she deserved to be Attorney General, and why those who tried to destroy good people through illegal means would always face the full consequences of their actions. The briefcase that had seemed like such an innocent prop had contained the complete destruction of everything Steele had built during his decades-long career. And Walsh had delivered that destruction with the same calm professionalism she brought to every aspect of her work, proving that sometimes the most devastating victories are won not through aggression or showmanship, but through careful preparation and an unwavering commitment to the truth. The federal detention center in downtown Washington resembled every other government building constructed in the 1970s: concrete walls, narrow windows, and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly ill. Marcus Steele sat in interview room C, his expensive blazer wrinkled from a night in a holding cell, his silver hair disheveled, and his usual media-trained composure completely absent. Across from him sat Special Agent Rebecca Chun, a 15-year veteran of the FBI's Public Corruption Unit, whose reputation for methodical case-building had earned her assignments involving some of the highest-profile political scandals of the past decade. Chun opened a thick manila folder, the same type that had become Patricia Walsh's signature weapon the previous evening at Reagan National. But where Walsh had wielded her documents with prosecutorial precision, Chun's approach was that of an investigator building toward an inevitable conclusion. She spread the contents across the metal table systematically, creating a timeline that stretched back 6 months and involved dozens of illegal database queries, financial transactions, and encrypted communications. "Mr. Steele," Chun began, her voice carrying the neutral tone of someone who had conducted thousands of similar interviews. "We've been monitoring your source inside the Transportation Security Administration for 3 months. Every communication, every payment, every piece of classified information that was illegally provided to your network has been documented and preserved as evidence." She placed a printed email at the center of the table, its header clearly showing Steele's personal account and a timestamp from 2 weeks earlier. The subject line read, "Walsh, Colorado Intel, Priority 1, and the message contained detailed flight information, hotel reservations, and even the names of family members Walsh planned to visit. The specificity of the intelligence was damning, particularly when viewed alongside federal statutes that made unauthorized access to government travel databases a serious felony. Steele stared at the email, his mind racing through the implications. He had received hundreds of similar messages over the past year, each containing information that had seemed too valuable and too specific to question its source. His contact at TSA, a disgruntled employee named David Kowalski, had assured him that the access was legitimate, part of routine security monitoring that could be shared with accredited journalists under Freedom of Information guidelines. The payments his network had made were, according to Kowalski, standard compensation for time and effort rather than payment for classified material. But now, sitting in a federal detention facility with evidence of his involvement spread across the table like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, Steele began to understand the magnitude of his mistake. Every email, every payment, every story he had published using Kowalski's intelligence had created a paper trail that federal investigators could follow with mathematical precision. The ambush journalism that had made his career was about to destroy it, and the irony was almost too bitter to contemplate. Chun continued laying out documents, each one more damaging than the last. Bank records showed payments totaling nearly $200,000 from Steele's network to various shell companies controlled by Kowalski. Phone records revealed dozens of encrypted calls between Steele and his source, many of them occurring immediately before major stories that relied on privileged government information. Email metadata demonstrated a clear pattern of coordination between illegal database access and media publication, creating a timeline that any prosecutor could use to establish criminal conspiracy beyond reasonable doubt. "Your source has already confessed," Chun said, placing a signed statement on the table. David Kowalski admitted to illegally accessing classified travel databases, selling government information to media outlets, and participating in a conspiracy to compromise national security protocols. He's cooperating fully with our investigation in exchange for a reduced sentence recommendation. The confession was devastating. Kowalski had provided detailed accounts of his relationship with Steele, including recordings of conversations where they discussed the sensitivity of the information being shared. In one particularly damaging excerpt, Steele could be heard acknowledging that some of the intelligence seemed too good to be legitimate sources, but expressing willingness to use it anyway as long as it couldn't be traced back to his network. The recording demonstrated conscious knowledge that the information might be illegally obtained, destroying any possible claim of innocent reliance on source protection. Chun turned to a new section of evidence, this one focused on the broader implications of the conspiracy. The illegal database access hadn't been limited to Patricia Walsh's travel information. Over the past year, Kowalski had provided Steele with privileged intelligence about dozens of government officials, including federal judges, cabinet members, and senior military personnel. Each breach had compromised security protocols designed to protect public servants from exactly the kind of targeted harassment that Steele specialized in delivering. "This isn't just about illegal database access," Chun explained, her voice taking on a more serious tone. "You've been participating in a conspiracy that compromised national security, violated the privacy of federal officials, and potentially endangered the safety of government personnel and their families. Some of the officials whose travel information was illegally obtained have received death threats that appear to be based on intelligence that only your source could have provided." The implications hit Steele like a physical blow. He had never considered that his ambush interviews might be connected to more serious threats against government officials. In his mind, aggressive journalism was protected speech, a vital component of democratic accountability that justified occasional ethical gray areas. The possibility that his work had facilitated actual violence against public servants was something he had never seriously contemplated, despite warnings from colleagues who questioned his increasingly extreme methods. Chun produced another document, this one bearing the letterhead of the Department of Homeland Security. It detailed security incidents involving government officials whose travel information had been compromised through the database breach conspiracy. 3 federal judges had received threatening phone calls that referenced their private travel plans. A cabinet secretary's family had been harassed at their vacation hotel by protesters who shouldn't have known their location. A military general's Wife had been followed by unknown individuals who appeared to have advanced knowledge of her shopping itinerary. Each incident had been investigated separately until intelligence analysts recognized the pattern connecting them to illegally obtained travel information. The investigation had led directly to Kowalski, whose digital footprints revealed not only his illegal database access, but also his financial relationship with Steele's network. What had begun as a routine security audit had evolved into a major federal investigation involving multiple agencies and potentially dozens of criminal charges. The evidence continued to mount with relentless precision. Chun displayed financial records showing that Steele's network had structured their payments to Kowalski in amounts designed to avoid federal reporting requirements. Email communications revealed discussions about maintaining operational security and protecting source methods. Phone transcripts captured conversations where Steele and his producers discussed the sensitivity of their intelligence and the need to stay ahead of any official investigations. Each piece of evidence reinforced the central narrative that Chun was building. This wasn't accidental involvement in someone else's criminal activity, but active participation in a conspiracy that Steele had helped to organize and direct. The payments, the security protocols, the structured communication methods all suggested conscious knowledge that the information being obtained was illegal and that significant effort was being made to avoid detection by law enforcement. But the most damaging evidence was yet to come. Chun opened a laptop computer and activated an audio file that filled the sterile interview room with the sound of Steele's own voice, recorded during a conversation with Kowalski 3 months earlier. The recording quality was excellent, suggesting that federal investigators had been monitoring the conspiracy for far longer than anyone had realized. In the recording, Steele could be heard discussing specific government officials he wanted to target with ambush interviews. He provided Kowalski with names, travel dates, and detailed requests for intelligence that would allow him to intercept them in vulnerable situations. Most damaging of all, he explicitly acknowledged that some of his requests might require Kowalski to push the boundaries of legitimate access, offering additional compensation for high-risk intelligence gathering. The conversation continued, with Steele describing his strategic approach to ambush journalism, including techniques for isolating targets, maximizing their discomfort, and creating viral moments that would dominate news cycles. He spoke about government officials as prey and described his work as hunting rather than reporting. The language was dehumanizing, predatory, and completely inconsistent with any legitimate journalistic purpose. Chun paused the recording and looked directly at Steele, her expression reflecting professional disappointment rather than personal animosity. In her years investigating political corruption, she had encountered many individuals who had lost their way while pursuing legitimate goals, but Steele's case was different. His actions suggested someone who had abandoned any pretense of serving the public interest in favor of personal aggrandizement and professional advancement. This recording was made with court authorization, Chun explained. We've been monitoring your communications with David Kowalski since federal investigators identified unusual patterns in classified database access. Every conversation, every email, every financial transaction has been documented and preserved as evidence of your participation in this conspiracy. She activated another audio file, this one capturing a conversation between Steele and his network's executive producer. In this recording, they discussed the strategic value of compromised government travel information and the competitive advantage it provided over other news organizations. The producer could be heard authorizing increased payments to Kowalski and encouraging Steele to maximize the intelligence gathering opportunity before law enforcement detected their operation. The conversation included explicit acknowledgement that their methods might be legally questionable, with the producer stating that the network's legal department had advised against certain information gathering techniques, but that the competitive benefits justified managed legal risks. This corporate knowledge of potential illegality destroyed any possible claim that Steele had been acting independently or without institutional support. Chun continued through the evidence methodically, each document and recording building toward an inevitable conclusion. She displayed correspondence between Steele and foreign media outlets, showing that he had attempted to sell some of the illegally obtained intelligence to international news organizations. She produced financial records indicating that Steele had personally profited from the conspiracy through speaking fees and consulting contracts that were directly tied to his access to privileged government information. The scope of the criminal enterprise was staggering. What had begun as a single corrupt relationship between a journalist and a government source had evolved into a complex conspiracy involving multiple media outlets, foreign entities, and sophisticated money laundering schemes. Steele hadn't just been receiving illegal information, he had been actively organizing and directing a criminal network that had compromised national security and endangered the safety of government officials. But perhaps the most personally devastating evidence came in the form of internal communications from Steele's own network. Chun produced emails between senior executives discussing the Steele problem and the need to maintain plausible deniability regarding his information sources. The messages revealed that network leadership had been aware of potential legal issues for months, but had chosen to continue supporting Steele's activities as long as they generated profitable content. One particularly damaging email from the network's legal counsel explicitly warned that Steele's methods appeared to violate federal statutes regarding unauthorized access to government information. The counsel recommended immediate suspension of the activities and comprehensive legal review of all related content. But network executives had overruled this recommendation, choosing instead to implement enhanced security protocols designed to make their involvement more difficult to detect. These internal communications demonstrated that Steele's criminal activity had been enabled and encouraged by institutional policies that prioritized profit over legal compliance. The conspiracy wasn't just the action of a single rogue journalist, it was the result of corporate decisions that had deliberately chosen to ignore legal and ethical boundaries in pursuit of competitive advantage. Chun closed her laptop and gathered the documents spread across the table. The evidence she had presented represented only a fraction of what federal investigators had assembled over months of careful investigation. The full scope of the conspiracy involved dozens of government officials, multiple media organizations, and potentially hundreds of violations of federal law. "Mr. Steele," she said, her voice carrying the finality of someone delivering an inevitable verdict, "you're facing charges that could result in 20 years in federal prison. Conspiracy to violate the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, conspiracy to violate the Espionage Act, money laundering, wire fraud, racketeering. The evidence against you is overwhelming, and your co-conspirators are already cooperating with our investigation." She paused, allowing the weight of the charges to settle in the sterile air of the interview room. Steele sat motionless, his usual media-trained responses completely absent. The confident predator who had stalked government officials through airport terminals and congressional hallways had been reduced to a confused and frightened defendant, facing the destruction of everything he had built during his decades-long career. But Chun wasn't finished. She opened one final folder, this one containing documents that would complete the destruction of Steele's reputation and eliminate any possibility of maintaining public sympathy for his situation. The folder contained communications between Steele and various extremist organizations, showing that he had been providing illegally obtained government travel information to groups that federal law enforcement had classified as potential domestic terrorism threats. The messages revealed that Steele had been in contact with individuals who had explicitly discussed plans to confront government officials at their private residences, family events, and personal travel destinations. Some of these communications included specific threats of violence, with Steele providing intelligence that would allow the groups to intercept officials in vulnerable situations where security protection might be minimal. This correspondence transformed Steele's case from a relatively straightforward corruption investigation into something far more serious. By providing classified travel information to individuals who had made explicit threats against government officials, he had potentially facilitated acts of domestic terrorism. The legal implications were staggering, with potential charges that could result in life imprisonment under federal anti-terrorism statutes. Chun displayed several particularly damaging communications, including one where Steele had provided detailed intelligence about a federal judge's family vacation to a group that had previously published the judge's home address and encouraged direct action against judicial officials who had issued unfavorable rulings. Another message showed Steele coordinating with activists who were planning to ambush a cabinet secretary at his daughter's wedding, providing specific venue information and travel logistics that could only have been obtained through illegal database access. The evidence was overwhelming, devastating, and completely inconsistent with any legitimate journalistic purpose. Steele hadn't just been pursuing aggressive interviews, he had been facilitating harassment, stalking, and potentially violent confrontations between extremist groups and government officials. The public interest justification that might have protected conventional investigative journalism was completely absent from activities that appeared designed to endanger public servants and their families. As Chun concluded her presentation of evidence, the door to the interview room opened and 2 additional federal agents entered. Their presence signaled that the investigative phase of Steele's case was ending and the prosecution phase was about to begin. In a few hours, he would be transferred to federal court for arraignment on charges that would dominate headlines for months and serve as a warning to other journalists who might be tempted to cross similar legal and ethical boundaries. The irony of his situation was inescapable. Steele had built his career by exposing the secrets of powerful people, by dragging them into public view and forcing them to account for their actions. Now he found himself in exactly the position he had created for so many others, facing overwhelming evidence, public humiliation, and the collapse of everything he had worked to achieve. The predator had become the prey, and the transformation had been accomplished with the same methodical precision he had once applied to destroying other people's reputations. But unlike many of his previous targets, Steele would face his reckoning in a courtroom rather than a television studio. The evidence against him wouldn't be presented through edited video clips and inflammatory commentary, but through the careful documentation of federal investigators who had built their case with mathematical precision. Justice would be served, not through viral social media campaigns and public shaming, but through the deliberate application of laws designed to protect national security and the safety of public servants. As the agents prepared to escort him back to his holding cell, Steele thought about Patricia Walsh boarding her flight to Colorado the previous evening. She had walked away from his ambush with her dignity intact and her reputation enhanced, heading home to attend her nephew's graduation exactly as her official itinerary had indicated. Her briefcase had contained the evidence that would destroy his career, but she had wielded that power with restraint and professionalism rather than vindictive satisfaction. The contrast between their approaches to power and information couldn't have been more stark. Walsh had used her knowledge to protect herself and uphold the law, while Steele had used his access to exploit and endanger others. She had demonstrated the qualities that made her suitable for high office, while he had revealed the corruption that made him unsuitable for any position of public trust. The airport encounter that was supposed to destroy her nomination had instead provided the perfect demonstration of why she deserved confirmation and why he deserved prosecution. The federal detention center's corridors were quiet as Steele was led back to his cell, but beyond those walls, the machinery of justice was already moving with inexorable force. Prosecutors were preparing indictments, investigators were following, additional leads, and the media outlets that had once celebrated his aggressive methods were beginning to distance themselves from the scandal that would redefine the boundaries of acceptable journalism. The hunter who had spent years pursuing others had finally been caught, and the consequences would serve as a lasting reminder that no one, regardless of their profession or their claimed noble purposes, was above the law. 6 months after the airport encounter that destroyed Marcus Steele's career, the E. Barrett Prettyman Federal Courthouse in Washington buzzed with the kind of energy reserved for the most significant trials of the decade. Media trucks lined Constitution Avenue, satellite dishes pointing skyward like technological flowers seeking signal instead of sunlight. Inside Courtroom 6, every seat was occupied by journalists, legal observers, and curious citizens who had followed the case from its explosive beginning to this climactic conclusion. Patricia Walsh sat in the witness stand for the third day of testimony, her composure as unshakable as it had been during that fateful evening at Reagan National Airport. She wore a navy blue suit that projected authority without ostentation, her auburn hair pulled back in the same professional style that had become her signature during confirmation hearings. The black leather briefcase that had contained Steele's downfall rested beside the prosecution table, its contents having been entered into evidence and dissected by legal experts for months. The transformation in public perception had been remarkable to witness. Walsh's confirmation as Attorney General had passed the Senate by a margin that surprised even her most optimistic supporters. The airport confrontation, initially intended to destroy her nomination, had instead provided the most compelling demonstration of her qualifications for the position. Videos of her calm dismantling of Steele's accusations had been studied in law schools as examples of prosecutorial excellence. Under pressure, her restraint in victory had impressed even former critics who had questioned her temperament for high office. Now, as the star witness in the federal prosecution of Marcus Steele and his co-conspirators, Walsh was providing the final pieces of testimony that would complete one of the most comprehensive corruption cases in recent memory. The prosecution had spent 5 months methodically building their case, calling dozens of witnesses and presenting thousands of pages of evidence that documented the scope and impact of the conspiracy that had masqueraded as aggressive journalism. Lead prosecutor Jennifer Martinez, a career federal attorney with an unblemished record of victories in high-profile corruption cases, approached the witness stand with the confidence of someone who had spent months preparing for this moment. Her questions would complete the government's case and provide the jury with a clear understanding of how Steele's criminal enterprise had operated and why it represented such a serious threat to democratic institutions. Attorney General Walsh, Martinez began, her voice carrying across the packed courtroom with crisp authority. When you encountered Mr. Steele at Reagan National Airport, did you have advanced knowledge of his illegal intelligence gathering activities? Walsh's response was measured and precise, delivered with the same calm professionalism that had characterized all of her testimony. I had been briefed by FBI counterintelligence specialists about unusual activity in federal travel databases, she said. The briefing indicated that classified information about government officials' movements was being illegally accessed and distributed to unauthorized parties. When Mr. Steele approached me with specific details about my travel plans, it confirmed that he was receiving illegally obtained intelligence. The answer was devastating to whatever remained of Steele's defense strategy. His attorneys had spent weeks arguing that their client was an unwitting victim of his source's criminal activity, a dedicated journalist who had been deceived by a corrupt government employee. But Walsh's testimony established that senior federal officials had been aware of the conspiracy and had been taking steps to document and prosecute it long before the airport confrontation occurred. Martinez continued her examination with surgical precision, each question designed to eliminate any remaining doubt about the scope and intentionality of Steele's criminal conduct. She guided Walsh through a detailed explanation of how the illegal Database access had compromised security protocols, endangered government personnel, and violated numerous federal statutes designed to protect sensitive information. The testimony revealed the full scope of the damage caused by Steele's activities. Over 18 months, his conspiracy had compromised the travel security of more than 200 federal officials, including Supreme Court justices, cabinet members, senior military officers, and federal judges. The intelligence had been used not only for Steele's own ambush interviews but had been distributed to extremist groups, foreign intelligence services, and other entities that posed potential threats to national security. Walsh explained how the investigation had uncovered a complex network of information brokers, corrupt government employees, and media organizations that had participated in what amounted to a systematic assault on government security protocols. The conspiracy had generated millions of dollars in profits through the sale of classified information, book deals based on illegally obtained intelligence, and consulting contracts that traded access to sensitive data for financial compensation. But the most damaging aspect of Walsh's testimony concerned the human impact of Steele's activities. She described how government officials and their families had been subjected to harassment, stalking, and threats based on travel information that should have remained classified. Several officials had been forced to modify their personal security arrangements, cancel family events, and alter their daily routines to protect themselves from individuals who had obtained their private information through Steele's network. One particularly disturbing case involved a federal judge whose family vacation plans had been leaked to a militia group that had previously threatened violence against judicial officials. The judge's teenage daughter had been followed by unknown individuals who photographed her at the family's hotel and posted the images online with threatening captions. The psychological trauma to the family had been severe, with the daughter requiring counseling and the judge requesting enhanced security protection for all family members. Walsh's testimony provided specific examples of how Steele's intelligence gathering had facilitated these attacks on government personnel. Email communications introduced as evidence showed that Steele had actively coordinated with extremist groups, providing them with detailed travel information and suggesting optimal times and locations for confronting officials. In some cases, he had provided tactical advice about how to maximize the psychological impact of these encounters. The evidence painted a picture of a journalist who had completely abandoned any pretense of serving the public interest in favor of personal profit and ideological extremism. Steele hadn't just been pursuing aggressive interviews, he had been orchestrating harassment campaigns designed to intimidate government officials and undermine democratic institutions. The illegal database access was merely the technical mechanism for a broader assault on the rule of law. Martinez turned to the specific evening at Reagan National Airport, asking Walsh to describe her preparation for the encounter and her strategic approach to handling Steele's ambush. Walsh's answer provided insight into the mindset that had enabled her to turn a potentially career-ending confrontation into a demonstration of prosecutorial excellence. I knew that Mr. Steele would attempt to ambush me based on illegally obtained travel information, Walsh testified. Federal investigators had briefed me on his methods and provided me with evidence of his criminal activities. My decision to carry that evidence with me was based on the understanding that he would eventually reveal his illegal sources through his questioning, providing an opportunity to confront him with documentation of his crimes. The strategy had been brilliant in its simplicity. Rather than avoiding Steele or attempting to prevent his ambush, Walsh had deliberately walked into his trap while carrying the evidence that would destroy him. She had allowed him to expose his own criminal activity by demonstrating his access to classified information, then had systematically dismantled his credibility using documentation that he had no opportunity to refute or contextualize. The psychological impact on Steele had been immediate and devastating. Video footage from airport security cameras, played for the jury during earlier testimony, show his transformation from confident predator to confused prey in a matter of minutes. His usual media-trained composure had completely collapsed under the weight of evidence he hadn't known existed, leaving him speechless and vulnerable in exactly the way he had made careers out of doing to others. Walsh's testimony continued with a detailed explanation of the legal and ethical principles that had guided her response to Steele's accusations. She emphasized that her primary obligation as a federal prosecutor was to uphold the law and protect national security, regardless of personal or political considerations. The evidence she had presented wasn't motivated by vindictiveness or political calculation, but by professional duty and commitment to democratic institutions. This distinction was crucial to the prosecution's case because it established Walsh's credibility as an objective law enforcement official rather than a political operative seeking revenge against a hostile journalist. Her measured response to Steele's aggression, her refusal to gloat or humiliate him beyond what the evidence required, and her immediate departure from the scene all demonstrated the kind of prosecutorial restraint that federal law requires and that the public expects from senior justice officials. Martinez concluded her direct examination by asking Walsh to address the broader implications of Steele's criminal enterprise for press freedom and democratic accountability. Walsh's response was carefully calibrated to acknowledge the vital role of journalism in democratic society while distinguishing between legitimate investigative reporting and criminal conspiracy. Journalism serves an essential function in our democracy, Walsh testified. Reporters have the right and the responsibility to hold government officials accountable through aggressive questioning and thorough investigation. But that right does not extend to criminal activity. When journalists participate in illegal database access, coordinate with extremist groups, or endanger the safety of public servants and their families, they have crossed the line from protected speech to criminal conspiracy. The answer effectively neutralized any attempt by Steele's defense team to portray his prosecution as an attack on press freedom. Walsh had clearly articulated the distinction between legitimate journalism and criminal activity, providing the jury with a framework for understanding why Steele's conviction was necessary to protect both democratic institutions and the integrity of the journalistic profession. Cross-examination by Steele's defense attorney, a prominent white-collar criminal lawyer named Robert Thornton, lasted for 2 grueling days but failed to undermine Walsh's credibility or create significant doubt about the prosecution's case. Thornton's strategy appeared to focus on portraying Steele as an overzealous journalist who had been manipulated by corrupt government sources, but Walsh's testimony had already established that senior federal officials were aware of the conspiracy and had been taking steps to document and prosecute it. Thornton's attempts to suggest that Walsh had entrapped Steele by deliberately walking into his ambush were particularly unsuccessful. Walsh calmly explained that law enforcement officials have no obligation to avoid contact with criminal suspects, and that her decision to carry evidence of Steele's crimes was a legitimate investigative technique designed to document his illegal activities. The suggestion that she had somehow acted improperly by allowing Steele to expose his own criminal conduct struck many observers as desperate and legally unfounded. The defense's broader strategy of portraying Steele as a victim of prosecutorial overreach was undermined by the overwhelming evidence of his criminal activities and the obvious harm those activities had caused to government personnel and national security. Thornton's closing argument, delivered with professional competence but obvious recognition of his client's hopeless position, focused on requesting leniency rather than asserting innocence. The prosecution's closing argument was delivered by Martinez with the kind of moral clarity that had characterized the entire case. She systematically reviewed the evidence against Steele, emphasizing the scope of his criminal enterprise, the harm it had caused to government personnel and democratic institutions, and the necessity of holding him accountable for his actions. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Martinez said, her voice carrying across the packed courtroom with unwavering conviction. "This case is about the rule of law and the principle that no one, regardless of their profession or their claimed noble purposes, is above the law." Marcus Steele violated federal statutes designed to protect national security and the safety of government personnel. He participated in a criminal conspiracy that generated millions of dollars in illegal profits while endangering the lives of public servants and their families. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle in the minds of the 12 citizens who would ultimately decide Steele's fate. "The defendant claims to be a journalist, but journalism is not what we have seen in this courtroom. We have seen evidence of criminal conspiracy, illegal database access, coordination with extremist groups, and systematic endangerment of government officials. We have seen a man who abandoned every principle of ethical journalism in pursuit of personal profit and ideological extremism." Martinez continued by highlighting the human cost of Steele's activities, describing the government officials and their families who had been subjected to harassment, stalking, and threats based on illegally obtained travel information. She emphasized that these weren't political figures who had volunteered for public scrutiny, but career civil servants, federal judges, and military personnel who deserved protection from criminal activity, regardless of their official responsibilities. "The evidence in this case is overwhelming," Martinez concluded. "The defendant's own communications, financial records, and recorded conversations establishes guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. Attorney General Walsh and her colleagues in federal law enforcement have provided you with a clear picture of criminal conspiracy that threatened national security and endangered innocent people. Your verdict must reflect the seriousness of these crimes and send a clear message that such conduct will not be tolerated in our democracy." The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. The speed of their decision reflected the overwhelming nature of the evidence and the clarity of the legal standards that Steele had violated. As the verdicts were read, Steele sat motionless at the defense table, his expression reflecting the complete collapse of his former confidence and the recognition that his career and reputation had been permanently destroyed. Judge Sarah Hoffman, a veteran federal jurist known for her careful application of sentencing guidelines and her respect for both prosecutorial discretion and defendant rights, scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later. Her preliminary comments suggested that Steele faced significant prison time, given the scope of his criminal activities and the harm they had caused to national security and individual victims. The media coverage of the trial's conclusion was extensive but notably different from the sensational reporting that had characterized Steele's own career. Major news organizations treated the verdict as a serious legal development with important implications for press freedom and government accountability, but they avoided the kind of inflammatory commentary and personal attacks that Steele had specialized in delivering. Editorial coverage was particularly thoughtful, with most major newspapers acknowledging the vital role of aggressive journalism in democratic society while recognizing the necessity of holding journalists accountable when they cross legal and ethical boundaries. The consensus among serious media observers was that Steele's conviction would actually strengthen press freedom by clearly distinguishing between legitimate investigative reporting and criminal conspiracy. Patricia Walsh's role in the case was universally praised, even by commentators who had previously questioned her qualifications for Attorney General. Her calm professionalism during the airport confrontation, her measured testimony during the trial, and her consistent emphasis on legal principles rather than personal vindication had demonstrated exactly the kind of prosecutorial excellence that the position required. The broader implications of the case extended far beyond Steele's individual prosecution. Federal agencies implemented new security protocols designed to prevent unauthorized access to classified databases. Media organizations adopted stricter guidelines for verifying the legitimacy of government sources and the legality of information gathering techniques. Law schools incorporated the case into their curricula as an example of how prosecutorial restraint and systematic evidence presentation could achieve justice without compromising democratic principles. But perhaps the most significant impact was on public understanding of the boundaries between legitimate journalism and criminal activity. The case had provided a clear example of how aggressive reporting could cross legal lines and endanger public safety, while also demonstrating that government officials could be held accountable through proper legal channels rather than extra-legal harassment. The sentencing hearing 6 weeks later drew another packed courtroom, though the atmosphere was notably more subdued than during the trial itself. Judge Hoffman had reviewed extensive pre-sentence materials, including victim impact statements from government officials whose safety had been compromised by Steele's activities and character references from journalists who had worked with him before his descent into criminal conduct. Steele's own statement to the court was brief and largely ineffective. He expressed regret for his actions but continued to maintain that his intentions had been to serve the public interest through aggressive journalism. His failure to acknowledge the full scope of his criminal conduct or the harm it had caused to individual victims seemed to confirm the prosecution's characterization of him as someone who had lost any sense of ethical boundaries in pursuit of personal advancement. Judge Hoffman sentenced Steele to 12 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. The sentence was within federal guidelines and reflected both the seriousness of his crimes and the absence of significant mitigating factors. The judge specifically noted that Steele's abuse of his position as a journalist had made his crimes particularly egregious, as it had undermined public trust in legitimate media institutions. In her sentencing remarks, Judge Hoffman addressed the broader implications of the case for both journalism and government accountability. She emphasized that the sentence was not intended to discourage aggressive reporting or limit press freedom, but to establish clear boundaries for investigative techniques and ensure that journalists, like all citizens, remained subject to the rule of law. The courthouse steps following sentencing became the site of Patricia Walsh's first extensive public comments about the case since her testimony months earlier. Speaking to a crowd of reporters and camera crews, she emphasized the importance of maintaining both press freedom and government accountability while ensuring that both journalists and officials remain subject to legal and ethical constraints. This case was never about limiting press freedom or protecting government officials from legitimate scrutiny. Walsh said, her voice carrying the same calm authority that had characterized her throughout the ordeal. It was about upholding the rule of law and ensuring that no one, regardless of their profession or their claimed noble purposes, can violate federal statutes without facing appropriate consequences. She continued by acknowledging the vital role of journalism in democratic society while emphasizing the distinction between legitimate investigative reporting and criminal conspiracy. Her comments were widely praised for their balance and their recognition of both the importance of press freedom and the necessity of legal accountability. The case had transformed Walsh from a controversial nominee into one of the most respected attorney generals in recent memory. Her handling of the Steele prosecution, combined with her broader approach to justice issues, had earned bipartisan praise and established her as a model of prosecutorial excellence. The airport confrontation that was supposed to destroy her career had instead provided the foundation for historic achievements in federal law enforcement. Marcus Steele, meanwhile, began serving his sentence at a federal correctional facility in Virginia, his reputation permanently destroyed and his career effectively ended. The man who had built his professional identity around exposing the secrets of powerful people had become the subject of the most comprehensive corruption investigation in recent memory. The predator had indeed become the prey, and the transformation had been accomplished through the systematic application of legal principles rather than the kind of personal destruction he had specialized in delivering. The briefcase that had contained his downfall was eventually returned to Patricia Walsh, who kept it in her office as a reminder of the importance of preparation, restraint, and commitment to legal principles. The documents that had destroyed Steele's career served as a permanent testament to the power of evidence over accusation, facts over speculation, and justice over vengeance. The story became a case study taught in law schools, journalism programs, and ethics courses across the country. It demonstrated how proper preparation and prosecutorial restraint could achieve justice while maintaining democratic principles and protecting institutional integrity. Most importantly, it showed that in a society governed by law, truth and evidence would ultimately prevail over aggression and manipulation. Years later, when asked about the airport encounter that had changed both their lives, Patricia Walsh would simply note that she had done what any competent prosecutor would do when confronted with evidence of criminal activity. She had presented the facts and allowed the legal system to determine the appropriate response. The measured tone of her response reflected the same professional restraint that had characterized her handling of the entire affair, proving that sometimes the most powerful victories are achieved not through dramatic confrontation, but through quiet competence and unwavering commitment to justice. The reverberations from the Steele conviction extended far beyond the marble halls of federal courthouses and the gleaming corridors of Washington newsrooms. In journalism schools across America, professors found themselves fundamentally restructuring their courses on investigative reporting and media ethics. The case had created a bright line between legitimate aggressive journalism and criminal conspiracy that would influence an entire generation of aspiring reporters. At Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism, Professor Elena Rodriguez spent an entire semester dissecting the Steele case with her advanced investigative reporting students. The classroom discussions were intense, sometimes heated, as young journalists grappled with the implications of a case that had sent one of their profession's most prominent figures to federal prison. Rodriguez had known Steele personally during his early career, when he had been a respected correspondent covering state politics with integrity and skill. The transformation from principled journalist to convicted felon served as a sobering reminder of how gradually ethical boundaries could erode when personal ambition overwhelmed professional responsibility. The students wrestled with difficult questions that had no easy answers. Where exactly was the line between aggressive source cultivation and criminal conspiracy? How could journalists verify the legitimacy of government sources without becoming complicit in illegal activity? What responsibilities did news organizations have to investigate the methods their star reporters used to obtain sensitive information? The Steele case had made these abstract ethical concepts intensely practical, with real consequences for careers and freedom. Rodriguez structured her course around the timeline of Steele's descent, using court documents and trial transcripts to show how small ethical compromises had snowballed into major criminal activity. The first payments to David Kowalski at TSA had been relatively modest, justified as routine compensation for a government source's time and expertise. But as the intelligence became more valuable and more clearly classified, the payments had increased dramatically, creating a financial dependency that made both parties more willing to take escalating risks. The professor emphasized how Steele's initial rationalization had been superficially reasonable. Government officials should be subject to public scrutiny, and their travel patterns were legitimate subjects of journalistic inquiry when they revealed potential conflicts of interest or misuse of public resources. But the methodology Steele had employed, illegal database access, coordination with extremist groups, and systematic harassment campaigns, had transformed legitimate journalistic goals into criminal conspiracy. One particularly thoughtful student, Sarah Chun, raised a question that would haunt many in the profession. If Steele's goals were legitimate, why hadn't he pursued them through legal means? Why hadn't he filed Freedom of Information Act requests, cultivated sources through traditional methods, or used public records to track government official travel? Rodriguez's answer was uncomfortable but necessary, because legal methods were slower, less comprehensive, and less likely to produce the kind of exclusive intelligence that had made Steele's career so profitable. The conversation highlighted one of the case's most disturbing implications. Steele hadn't been forced into criminal activity by lack of alternatives. He had chosen it because it was more effective than legal journalism. The competitive pressure of modern media, with its emphasis on breaking news and exclusive content, had created incentives that made illegal methods attractive to ambitious reporters willing to rationalize their choices. At Northwestern University's Medical School, similar discussions were taking place under the guidance of Professor Michael Harrison, a former federal prosecutor who had transitioned into academia after 20 years in the Justice Department. Harrison brought a unique perspective to the case, having worked with attorneys like Patricia Walsh during his government service. He understood both the legal principles at stake and the practical challenges of prosecuting public figures without appearing to target the press. Harrison's students were particularly interested in Walsh's strategic approach to the airport confrontation. How had she known to bring the evidence with her? Why had she chosen to engage with Steele rather than avoiding the encounter entirely? What legal and ethical considerations had guided her decision to present damaging information in such a public setting? The professor explained that Walsh's approach reflected sophisticated understanding of both prosecutorial strategy and media dynamics. By allowing Steele to initiate the confrontation, she had avoided any appearance of improper prosecution tactics or media manipulation. By responding to his accusations with documented evidence, she had demonstrated the kind of factual precision that effective prosecutors must maintain. Most importantly, by remaining calm and professional throughout the encounter, she had shown the temperament and judgment that high office required. But Harrison also used the case to explore more complex questions about the relationship between law enforcement and the media. Government officials possess significant power to influence public perception through strategic release of information, and the Steele case had demonstrated how that power could be used responsibly. Walsh had neither leaked information to friendly reporters nor staged dramatic confrontations for political advantage. Instead, she had simply responded to criminal activity with appropriate legal action, allowing the evidence to speak for itself. The academic analysis of the case extended beyond journalism schools into law schools, where constitutional scholars debated its implications for First Amendment protections and government accountability. Professor Janet Morrison at Harvard Law School assigned the case to her constitutional law students as an example of how press freedom principles operated in practice when journalists engaged in clearly criminal activity. Morrison's students discovered that the case had actually strengthened First Amendment protections by clearly distinguishing between legitimate journalism and criminal conspiracy. Previous cases involving reporter privilege and government source protection had been complicated by ambiguous fact patterns and unclear legal standards. The Steele case provided crystal clear examples of criminal conduct that no reasonable interpretation of press freedom could protect. The Supreme Court had declined to hear Steele's appeal, letting stand the lower court's conviction and establishing important precedent for future cases involving journalist misconduct. Legal scholars noted that the court's refusal to intervene suggested broad consensus that Steele's activities had crossed legal lines that even the most expansive interpretation of press freedom could not excuse. Meanwhile, at the Department of Justice, Attorney General Patricia Walsh was implementing comprehensive reforms designed to prevent future cases like Steele's while protecting legitimate investigative journalism. The reforms included new protocols for handling journalist inquiries, enhanced security measures for government databases, and clear guidelines for distinguishing between appropriate and inappropriate media requests for information. Walsh's approach to these reforms reflected the same measured professionalism that had characterized her handling of the Steele case. She consulted extensively with journalism organizations, civil liberties groups, and government security experts to develop policies that would protect both press freedom and national security. The resulting guidelines were praised by media advocates and law enforcement officials alike as balanced and practical. The new protocols established clear procedures for journalists seeking access to government information, including verification requirements designed to prevent the kind of illegal database access that had enabled Steele's criminal enterprise. Government employees were provided with specific training on identifying and reporting suspicious requests for classified information, while journalists were given clearer guidance on appropriate methods for cultivating government sources. Perhaps most importantly, the reforms created new whistleblower protections for government employees who reported illegal information sharing within their agencies. The Steele case had revealed that multiple TSA employees had been aware of Kowalski's illegal activities, but had been reluctant to report them due to fear of retaliation. The new protections were designed to encourage early reporting of suspicious activity before it could escalate into major security breaches. The impact of these reforms extended throughout the federal government as agencies updated their security protocols and training programs to address the vulnerabilities that Steele's conspiracy had exploited. The Government Accountability Office conducted comprehensive reviews of database security across all federal agencies, identifying and addressing weaknesses that could enable future breaches. But the most profound changes were occurring within news organizations themselves, as media executives grappled with the implications of employing journalists whose methods might expose their companies to criminal liability. Major news networks implemented new verification procedures for sensitive information, required additional legal review of stories based on government sources, and established clearer guidelines for source compensation and protection. The Washington Post's executive editor, Amanda Foster, spoke candidly about the challenges the Steele case had created for news organizations. In an industry already struggling with declining revenues and increased competition, the additional legal and ethical scrutiny required by post-Steele protocols imposed significant costs and delays on investigative reporting. But Foster acknowledged that these burdens were necessary to maintain public trust and protect the long-term viability of serious journalism. Some critics argued that the reforms would have a chilling effect on aggressive investigative reporting, making journalists more cautious about pursuing sensitive stories and cultivating controversial sources. But supporters pointed out that legitimate journalism had always operated within legal boundaries, and that clarifying those boundaries would actually protect good reporters from inadvertent legal exposure while deterring bad actors like Steele. The debate reflected deeper tensions within the journalism profession about the proper balance between aggressive reporting and ethical responsibility. Steele's conviction had forced the profession to confront uncomfortable questions about competitive pressure, financial incentives, and the gradual erosion of traditional ethical standards in pursuit of exclusive content and viral exposure. The annual conference of the Society of Professional Journalists. These issues dominated panel discussions and hallway conversations. Veteran reporters shared stories of ethical dilemmas they had faced during their careers, while younger journalists expressed concern about navigating an increasingly complex legal and ethical landscape. The consensus was that the profession needed to do better at self-regulation and ethical education to prevent future cases like Steele's. The conference featured a keynote address by Patricia Walsh, who spoke about the importance of maintaining both press freedom and government accountability within a framework of legal and ethical responsibility. Her remarks were notable for their balanced tone and their recognition of journalism's vital democratic function, even as she emphasized the necessity of holding all citizens, including journalists, accountable for criminal conduct. Walsh's address received a standing ovation from an audience That included many reporters who had initially opposed her nomination as Attorney General. The transformation in their perception reflected the broader shift in public opinion that had occurred following the Steele case. Walsh had demonstrated through her actions that strong law enforcement and press freedom were complementary rather than competing values, and that principled prosecution could actually strengthen democratic institutions. The international implications of the case were also significant, as foreign governments and international organizations studied the American approach to balancing press freedom with national security concerns. The European Union's Media Freedom Commission cited the Steele case as an example of how democratic societies could address journalist misconduct without compromising fundamental rights. Several countries implemented similar reforms to their own database security and media oversight procedures. But perhaps the most lasting impact of the case was on public perception of both journalism and government accountability. Polling data showed increased public confidence in federal law enforcement's ability to investigate criminal activity impartially, regardless of the political prominence or professional status of suspects. At the same time, surveys indicated that most Americans distinguished clearly between Steele's criminal conduct and legitimate investigative journalism, suggesting that the case had not damaged public support for press freedom more broadly. The Steele case had become a defining moment for American democracy, demonstrating that the rule of law could be applied fairly and effectively, even in high-profile cases involving powerful media figures. Patricia Walsh's measured approach to the prosecution had shown how government officials could protect national security and individual rights without compromising democratic principles or engaging in political persecution. As the months passed and the immediate controversy faded, the case settled into its role as a landmark precedent that would influence journalism, law enforcement, and government accountability for years to come. Law students would study Walsh's strategic approach to prosecutorial decision-making. Journalism students would analyze Steele's ethical failures as cautionary examples, and government employees would follow enhanced security protocols designed to prevent similar breaches. The black leather briefcase that had contained Steele's downfall remained in Walsh's office, a quiet reminder of the importance of preparation, evidence, and professional restraint in pursuing justice. It had become a symbol of how systematic investigation and careful documentation could achieve accountability without resorting to the kind of theatrical confrontation that Steele had specialized in delivering. The briefcase represented the triumph of substance over spectacle, facts over accusations, and justice over vengeance principles that would continue to guide American democracy long after the immediate participants in the case had moved on to other challenges and opportunities. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.